Hello and welcome back to a new video on this channel. Today we're gonna create a stylized swamp scene. My goal with the scene was to make it feel kind of mystic, but still kind of cozy and relaxing at the same time. This video is not gonna be a detailed tutorial, but more of a quick breakdown video, going through the steps of the process, some things I learned and some mistakes I made. So let's just get right into it. The first part was as always gathering reference for the scene. And you can see my Purif file right here, where I gather all my reference images. Most of them are from Pinterest, but also some from ArtStation, and 2 screenshots from Kana Bridge of Spirits. In Blender I created a simple blockout, but I didn't spend too much time on it, which was stupid, because in the end it would have saved me a lot more time if I had just created a better blockout, as you'll see later in the video. Then I got into the asset creation, and I started with this root made with geometry nodes, which I did following a tutorial which I don't understand at all, but the result turned out pretty nice. Then I created the tree, and I mean the tree because I only created one tree for the entire scene, but it's not really noticeable in the final render, so I just went with it. I'm not gonna go too deep into the creation of the tree because I've already done that a few times on this channel, but I'll do it really quick. First I used the curve to create the rough shape of the trunk, and then I also used smaller curves for the branch and roots. Then I joined them all together and sculpted the surface of the tree. Then in Substance Painter I gave it a brown color with a slightly brighter curvature generator to highlight the edges, and then I added a light generator with a green texture to add moss on all the sides that face to the top. Then I needed a texture for the vines hanging down the tree. And since I couldn't find one on the internet which fitted the style I wanted to create, I just used a realistic one and put it into Stable Diffusion. There, with the image-to-image generation, I got a texture which perfectly fitted the style I wanted to create. I imported that image into Blender and subdivided it a bunch of times so I could perfectly align it to the branches. As a final touch, I wanted to add some moss to the tree, and for that I used a free Real Snow add-on, which, as the name says, is normally for snow, but you can just switch up the material and get pretty nice looking moss. And with that the tree was done, and I moved on to the next object of the scene, which was the hut. So it started with a simple cube with a subdivision in the middle, so I could pull up the roof and then extrude the top faces. Then at the front of the house I added a little roof for the door, and I added 2 windows, one on the side and one on the roof. To make the hut look more interesting, I wanted to add some giant roots growing up the building, and I first tried doing this with the Ivy Gen add-on, but I couldn't really get good results, and so I used the same root from before, but without the smaller roots going around it. After texturing it in Substance Painter, I used the clover from the Stylized Nature video, and I created a new strand of grass, and I scattered them on a few spots using weight painting. I also made this rock right here, and with the same technique as before, I put some moss on it. So now that I had my assets, I started placing them into my scene. And as you can see right here, I used weight painting to make like patches of clover and grass so they don't intersect with each other. That just adds a bit more variation to the ground and makes it look way more interesting in my opinion. So I worked on the scene for actually a few hours, but I noticed that it just wasn't really working out. So with a heavy heart I decided to start over and create a new scene. But after working on the second scene for a little while, I noticed that it wasn't working out too, and so I started over a second time. This would have probably been avoidable if I'd spent more time in the blockout, but I think it's pretty important to being able to start over when a scene isn't working out, even though you spend a lot of time on it. So for the third time I created 2 planes. One would be the ground and one would be the water. I pulled down the water plane slightly below the ground plane, so I could subdivide the ground plane a bunch of time, and then with the proportional editing pull it down on some spots to create puddles. Then I thought a bit about the story of the artwork. I already shortly talked about storytelling in a different video, but I think it's incredibly important. When I create an artwork I always try to think of a story and add details after that story. So in my case it would be that there's a hut in this swamp where probably somebody's living, and this person needs to get there, so they need a pathway, and when they get there when it's dark they need light on a pathway. And I think that's a great way to add detail because everything is grounded in the artwork. But I think it's important to note that you don't need to think of a story before creating an artwork necessarily, but rather think of it in the process of creating the artwork. So for the pathway I first added a cylinder and I textured it to look like a log. Then I created a curve and I formed it like I wanted the pathway to run along. Then I added an array modifier to the log to make this chain of logs, and then with the curve modifier I made it run along the curve which I just created. So as I just said, the path needs some lighting, and so we're now going to create a lantern. I approached this model pretty similar to the tree model, so first creating a curve and adding some depth to it to make it thicker. Then I extruded some branches and I formed the top one specifically so it could hold the lamp, and I also made 2 cut-off branches just to add some more detail. Then I wanted a root looping around the stem, and I made that with a curved spiral, which you can add if you activate the Add Curve Extra Objects add-on, which is pre-installed in Blender. So then I added this little chain and started working on the lamp itself. This model was pretty simple, formed out of a cylinder, and I also gave it a subdivision surface modifier, which kind of gives it that rounded, stylized look, which I really like. Then when this was done, I exported the whole model and threw it into Substance Painter, where I mainly used smart materials from the models before. So I used the root material from the big root and the tree material for the big stem in the middle. Then back in Blender, I added moss just like before with the add-on, and I used geonodes to scatter the plants on the moss. Then I duplicated the lamp a few times and placed it along the curve. And I made the lantern emissive, but I also added an extra light, because I could have just turned up the emissiveness, but this would have destroyed the texture, so I added a point light in every lamp. Then I also wanted to add a bush, but I didn't have a stylized leaf texture. And so I went back to Stable Diffusion and I put in my shitty drawn branch texture, and it gave me a result that I was actually very happy with. And so I imported this texture into Blender and scattered it on a deformed sphere. Then I gave the branch a bit of translucency, and with that the bush was finished. Back to our scene, I first went with a daylight scenario, but later I realized that it would look way better if I put it to nighttime, and so I just switched up the HDRI image. I also used 2 volumetrics, one in the front and one in the back, but the one in the back was way stronger to hide the background a bit. This just gives the render a nice mysterious feeling. Now to the foliage, I first used the manual geonode setup to scatter them, but I later came to my senses and downloaded the free Grasswall G-Scatter add-on, which sped up the process like 10x. Then I thought the scene still looked a bit too empty, and so I created this very simple reed model and placed it around and inside of the puddles. Then for a few final touches, I added little fireflies by creating small light emitting spheres and adding a noise modifier in the graph editor to make them move. Then I also made the lantern swing a bit in the wind, and I used shape keys to make the vines in the front move a bit too. Finally, I added a subtle camera movement and then rendered. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way to the end. I hope you could learn a thing or two, and I hope we see each other again in the next video, which hopefully won't be in 4 months.